So, Proverbs 31, and we were talking about marriage relationships, husband,
Yeah.
wives, and so in the Christian faith, most men, most fathers will take their sons and say,
Uh-huh.
"This is the woman you want to marry." And
Uh-huh.
every single female or every single one I've ever talked to, and as a woman raised in a Christian home, I read that and I think I can never do it. I can never be that. And we like beat ourselves up. But one day I read a book, and in it, the author
Are you talking
was,
about the woman of valor and
yes,
Proverbs
yes,
31? Okay.
Proverbs 31.
Yeah,
And in
31 10,
it,
I believe.
the
Yeah.
the author befriended a Jewish couple, and the woman was telling the Jewish woman was telling the Christian woman, "You got it all wrong. You're using this to beat yourself up and beat up every Christian woman that they can never reach this ideal." And but that isn't how we as Jews read this poem. So
Mhm.
I know this is not really scripted or planned, but as somebody who was raised and is Jewish, when you read that, kind of what's the filter for that? I'd love to hear a Jewish perspective
So
on
here I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because I don't know what the Christian perspective is. So I'll just start from scratch.
okay.
Okay. So Proverbs 31 verse 10 is the woman of valor. It's usually translated. That's the translation I've heard. In Hebrew, it's Eshet Chayil. And I have an interesting story about that. So for years, my prayer to God was, give me the Eshet Chayil, put me together with the Eshet Chayil. Um, and I met my wife and we got engaged. And I put a post on Facebook and I said, I've finally met my Eshet Chayil. And I finally met the Eshet Chayil. And people to this day, in fact, 4 years later, there are people who think her name is Chael. They think first name Eshet, last name Chael.
Oh, no.
So, woman of valor, Eshet Chayil. Who is she? What is she? So, I grew up in America, and there was this kind of 1950s ideal: the woman stays at home, and she's barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, and and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that if you can afford to do that, but frankly, most families can't afford to do that today, um, and and that's not the ideal that's described in the Eshet Chayil in Proverbs 31:10. 31:10 is really interesting because it's what's called an acrostic poem. Acrostic is a fancy word for the first letter of each line represents something. And in this case, it's an alphabet. So it's an alphabetic acrostic. So the first line, Eshet, that's the first word is Eshet, which is Aleph. And then it's Bet and Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, right? So it's the letters of the alphabet. So why did they do that? So it could be they were just trying to be cute. But in this case, it was because most people didn't have scrolls. They couldn't afford books. So how do you have access to information? We have to memorize it. So how can I memorize a whole vast amount of information? So one way to do that is an alphabetic acrostic. So this poem is written according to the alphabet so that young Israelite men 3,000 years ago would memorize this. And all they had to know was the alphabet, which most people apparently knew, and that would help them memorize the poem, right? If they couldn't remember what's the next line, oh, that's Dalid, right? Because we just said Gimel, and then after that is Hey, right? So what's the poem about? The poem is about this woman who works really hard because life is difficult, both in the ancient world and today, um, and she works hard and provides for her family, and she helps her husband, and he's sitting in the gate, with the other men. And what does that mean, sitting in the gate? That's one of the metaphors there, or one of maybe not metaphors, maybe one of the literal things. So the gate of every city was where the elders would gather, and it wasn't just like an opening in the wall. It was the gatehouse, right? So it was a court, and it was right. So if you remember in the story of Ruth, Boaz takes Naomi to the city gate, and he proclaims to the elders that this is my wife, right? And that is what ancient marriage was. You would make it a public declaration that the woman would accept, right? She says, no, I'm not. Then it didn't count. But he would declare, this is my wife, and then they would go home and they would consummate the wedding. That is what, right? You didn't get a piece of paper from the government, right? That didn't exist. So, it's what they call, so it's a public declaration along with consummation and living together, right? So where is he doing that? He's doing that in the gate. So it says there that, she's working hard while her husband is sitting in the gate with the elders, right? He's one of the judges, right? She's such an amazing wife. She's Superwoman, right? He actually has the time, not just to toil in the fields all day, but he has the opportunity at some point during the day to go and sit in the gate with the elders, right? So yeah, this is, let's say, the super. So Eshet Chayil, how does that translate? So roughly something like Superwoman, right? Now, not everybody can be Superwoman. That's something to my wife happens to be, but that is something you aspire to and you strive to be. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers the question.
But. Yeah. So in the book that I was reading, the women would be more like, it's like a you go girl, like, yeah, you did that and you accomplished and you had a challenge and you rose to the challenge, you go girl, kind of a thing, rather than this impossible standard that like hangs over our heads of, yep, that's why I'm not good enough. Yep, that's why I can't do that.
So there's this Christian idea that you have to be perfect. In the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it says, Solomon is kneeling before God when he dedicates the temple in 1 Kings 8. And he says, there is no man that does not sin, and then he goes on to say, and therefore, God, it's good that you're merciful, because otherwise we wouldn't have a chance. And so this is something to aspire to. Nobody's perfect and nobody perfectly fulfills it, but it is something to aspire to. And the goal is not to say, oh, you're so deficient because, look at what the Eshet Chayil does. No, it's okay. This is a model to aspire to. It isn't a model that all cultures share. In Afghanistan, they just passed a law that the voice of adult women is not allowed to be heard in public, right? That's not the Eshet Chayil standard. That's a completely alien concept, right? And women have to be covered so only their eyes are visible in Afghanistan. And that's the law. Well, in ancient Israel, you read the story of Judah and Tamar. A woman who covers her face is assumed to be a prostitute. Otherwise, why is she hiding her face? She's embarrassed that when she leaves her job, people will know who she is. That's why she hides her face in ancient Israel, right? So the point is, different cultures have different standards. And you might think, well, some men might think, that's the ultimate woman, the Afghani woman who nobody sees her, nobody hears her. That's not the Tanakh. That's certainly not the Proverbs 31:10 standard of Eshet Chayil. And the Tanakh standard is, no, a woman should be seen. The woman who hides her face, it's because she has something to hide. She's doing something nefarious, right? So there's different cultures with different standards. And I think that's why, even if nobody, no human could possibly fulfill Proverbs 31 perfectly, nobody could live up to that. It does show you this is the standard we should strive for. And there are different standards out there in the world. And it gives you, as you say, it's a baseline, right? You might have something in your heart that's wrong that you believe. And look, there's wrong beliefs I have every day. I discover new things and I say, oh, I was wrong. It's wonderful. Now I've been corrected. That's great. Wow. Now I have the truth. One of the really powerful things about the modern world, there's many things that are wrong with the modern world. And here's where like the postmodernist wokeism is undoing this. One of the greatest accomplishments of the modern world is this idea of the scientific method, right? So I have an idea and I think I'm right about something, but I test it and I see it's wrong. Okay, I change it. I revise the hypothesis, right? So, but the wokeism says, well, I have a lived experience, so it doesn't matter what any evidence presented to me. That's false, because I know in my lived experience this is true. No, that's not that. That's what led to superstition. That's what led to, like George Washington was killed, but because he was sick and they drained his blood, because they thought that, well, you have bad humors. They called it humors. We'll release those by making cuts in your arm, and they'll, no, well, we know better now than that because we've done experiments and we saw that didn't work. So, and I think the beautiful thing about scripture is, okay, I might have an idea and a belief, and if I see something different in scripture, I have to revise my hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
So and if somebody says, don't believe your lying eyes because we tell you that scripture's wrong, well, I'm going to go with scripture.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely, every time. Yeah, because those facts of events don't necessarily lead to truth, and I think that's a key that we all need to keep in our minds as we go through life